Hello, I'm Del McGurk, and I'd just like to start off by saying thank you to Wild Oxfordshire for inviting me to speak to you this evening. I'm going to be talking about weaving nature into the future of a growing village through neighbourhood planning. I'm going to start off by just explaining my interest. For the purposes of this event, I'm a resident of Benson village and the green infrastructure lead for our neighbourhood plan. I also work for Natural England, so I've got a professional interest, I suppose, across this whole arena, but I should just say that I'm not a planning expert. So how did I become involved in all of this? So looking back about 5 years ago, I was running a team that was doing some thinking about ecological networks and how we move that whole agenda on. And I really wanted to get under the skin of how the things that we were thinking about at a national policy level play out on the ground. So when my village decided to develop a neighbourhood plan, I jumped at the opportunity to roll up my sleeves and do some learning. So I made the case for a green infrastructure strand in the plan and ended up leading it. And this session is about sharing some of our experiences through that process. I should emphasise that we have by no means got it all right or gone about it the best way around. So, and I think that will come out through the rest of the session tonight. So I'm going to start off by just explaining, setting the scene in Benson, the circumstances we were dealing with and what we set out to achieve. And I'll delve into the specifics of the neighbourhood plan that we came up with and the sort of the approach that we took. And then finally share a summary of the lessons we learned as we went about it. So what can I tell you about Benson? This is just a little bit of orientation, where it is, but more importantly, some of the specific local circumstances. So Benson's about halfway between Oxford and Reading on the bank of the Thames. It's got a really sort of, I suppose, a broad array of community facilities, sort of surprising for its size. And it's pretty well served for public transport, sort of in particular buses. But the really key thing to draw out about Benson is that it's a village that is facing significant growth. So to say a little bit more about that in planning terms, it's worth just having a look at Benson's geographic and landscape context. So Benson's a large village in planning terminology, so it was always going to be expected to take a proportion of the district's growth for housing. It's not in the green belt, and the vast majority of the parish is not in an AONB, though it is in sight of two AONBs. So the North Wessex Downs just across the river, opposite the village, and then up the hill a little bit, you find the edge of the Chiltern Hills. But with that set of circumstances and all of those village services and good public transport links, you can sort of see why, from a planner's perspective, it's of interest in terms of housing and growth. The other bit of context to draw out is that in 2016, the district didn't have a 5-year land supply at the time. So a place like Benson was always going to struggle to manage the development pressure. And to be frank, we had numerous sites around the village that were in scope, with developers and landowners actively promoting theirs at the time. And this next slide, this little map, just give you a feel for the scale of it. With all of these sites, sort of 8, 9 of them at one point being actively promoted at one time or another. So neighbourhood planning was really, really important to us. And it hasn't been a sort of a quick and easy, trouble-free experience, but it's been so worth the effort that we put in. I think I would just say that it's been such a valuable thing to be able to give the community some sense of control. Neighbourhood planning for me creates the basis for a discussion, and it's a means to set out for the community to set out where it wants development, but more importantly, how it wants to be undertaken in the community. So for Benson, neighbourhood planning could never be about adopting a defensive sort of arms folded position, sort of saying no, hoping to fend off development. And it dawned on us pretty quickly that we needed a sort of a really constructive approach that recognised that that some growth was part of our future, and working out what we needed to do and what we needed to get from that as a community. So we'll come on to look at the specifics of the plan in a few minutes, but I think it's worth just having a look at the main thing that ended up shaping our strategy, with everything else sort of hanging off that. And it was a mix of solving a specific problem that the community cared about, and also dealing with the practical realities of the village layout. So Benson's it's a historical place. It's an old coaching village. And by all accounts, it was the first change of horses on the coaching run between Oxford and London. And at one point had 16 inns, and it's really not that big a place. So that paints a picture for you. But coming bang up to date, it's on one of the busiest B roads in the country. So we have a lot of traffic, including HGVs, coming through the village. And one of the key asks from the community was to sort out that issue, with lots of cars and lorries steaming round narrow bends, particularly by the school, on sort of two wheels. So I guess to summarise, Benson has always been busy. Coaching days are modern day. But the point is, I suppose, is that the road network was designed for coaches. And for some parts of the village, that creates real problems with the kind of the volume of and weight of modern traffic that we experience. So this slide just shows, I suppose, the traffic nexus where the two strategic routes collide. So one running north-south between Oxford and Reading, and then the east-west one, which runs from Benson over towards the M40. The other bit in terms of the spatial strategy is that on the southern side we're bounded by the airfield at the RAF station. So we ended up, when you think about those sites that I just showed you a couple of minutes ago, where there was a sort of like a natural solution from a spatial perspective, which was to select sites to the north of the village, where there was an option to tie together proposals from a number of different developers and find a way of ameliorating that traffic problem, and putting in place some infrastructure that was designed, I suppose, to handle this sort of traffic properly and safely. You'll just see the little circle with the 1932 gap, as I call it. It's always been perceived in Benson that this problem has been perceived and foreseen for a long time, and the potential for a solution as well. And the other thing I should say is that Relief Road is a slightly grand term, I think, for what this is. This is not a 70-mile-per-hour dual carriageway with metal barriers up the centre. This is an estate road that we've managed to sort of connect together through constructive engagement and negotiation with 3 separate developers at no cost to the public purse. So I want to come on now to the nature perspective for Benson. So this is a map. I think the map will actually be familiar to a lot of the participants on today's call. This is the conservation target area map. So basically, for those not initiated in this, the yellow shading flags those areas that are already valuable for wildlife, and connecting up to sites that might be good to invest conservation effort or further money in making better for wildlife. So Benson's in the so-called white space in the middle. So you've got the Chiltern Chalk downland and woodlands off to the southeast, and then wetland habitats going up the Thames to the northwest. So, for example, very close to us, but just one parish up, is the River of Life project, which is on the Earth Trust land, a sort of an Environment Agency funded project. But I think my point is with this is that being in that white space doesn't mean that Benson hasn't got a lot to celebrate. And actually, personally, I think that we really do need to be thinking about the contribution that places like Benson make as part of the wider Lowton picture. So zooming into the village itself, when we came to look at the array of blue and green assets in the village, we found, to our surprise, there was actually quite a lot there that we wanted to recognise through the neighbourhood plan process. So Benson's got a chalk stream. It's the shortest one in the Chilterns, running from New Elm down to the Thames. It's got some little pockets of hidden meadows. It's got the usual array of community amenity green spaces. And it's just got this really great connectivity out into the wider countryside through public access routes, and including the Thames Path National Trail, which skirts the village. And interestingly as well, RAF Benson, which is, I suppose, the dominant feature in the centre of the parish, big sort of semi-improved grassland, it turned out to have a surprising level of ecological interest when we surveyed. So, in summary, we had some really good raw material, I think, in the village, in terms of thinking about green infrastructure, and really something to build on. So, a few headlines about the plan. It took about 2.5 years to develop from the starting point until the plan was made, just after a successful referendum. We had quite an array of themes. And as I think I've probably hinted, green infrastructure wasn't the starting point of our plan, or the main sort of like strategy. But we pushed hard as a sort of a group within the wider team for a plan that had nature woven into it. So green infrastructure is a standalone theme in the plan, but we also looked to make the links more broadly where we could, and really sort of weave environment and nature into other parts of the plan. So our green infrastructure themes focused on treating the array of spaces that we had like a network, so celebrating the ones that we've got and adding in some new ones. And we also went after biodiversity enhancements in the built development, sort of chasing this concept of creating developments that are permeable to wildlife. And just in terms of starting to share the lessons, one of the things that dawned on us as we went through this process of describing our objectives and realising them was that for a green infrastructure plan to really fly, you need more than a neighbourhood plan. So neighbourhood planning it deals very specifically with matters of land use and planning policies. And there's a bit of a risk that as you describe your kind of wider ambitions, that some local authorities and inspectors will simply score out text that they don't think is relevant to the nature and role of a neighbourhood plan. So we produced a parish or sort of village people and nature strategy in order to set some context for the neighbourhood planning policies that we were putting in place, and to take forward sort of the wider ambitions that came around that. So we've got 3 big guiding objectives, one being the spotlight on our chalk stream. Action for pollinators has been a really important thing to us, really in shaping a lot of the way that we manage our green spaces and think about the new ones. And access to green space for people, for a variety of reasons, we felt was really important to how our community interacted with the environment. And we also recognised an array of sort of cross-cutting themes that we wanted to pay attention to around, inspiring and mobilising support, and also, I suppose, picking up that positive engagement with developers that was built into the neighbourhood plan. So if I have time at the end, I'll maybe just share a few insights about some of that wider stuff that we do. Let's see how it goes. So, a quick mention of the neighbourhood plan process. It's quite structured. I'm sure there are lots of people on the call tonight who've been involved in neighbourhood planning. But I suppose the reality is that every set of circumstances is different, and it can take a really long time and an awful lot of graft to get it right and work your way through it. And that cartoon just on the right of the slide, it really made me smile when I saw that, because I sort of thought, well, yeah, that's exactly how neighbourhood planning has felt to me. I think the other thing to reflect is that it's intended to be sort of fairly linear, but inevitably it's really quite a sort of an iterative process. And also delivery is in bold for a reason. It's that point really around the fact that the job doesn't finish with the making of the neighbourhood plan. There's quite a lot really to do in order to make sure that you actually realise the ambitions that you first set out, or that shaped what you were intending to do. So I'm just going to come on to show 2 slides on the green infrastructure policies in the plan. I'm not going to cover the totality of the plan. The Benson plan has a mix of site-specific and thematic policies. So the former simply allocate the sites and specify what you want on them. So these slides focus on the thematic green infrastructure policies, and I've set them out in loose, sort of similar sort of related blocks. The first block there on the top left of the slide is the kind of like, I suppose, the nature sort of specific, biodiversity specific set of policies. And the key one to focus on there was the idea of looking to secure funding for the long-term management of the green spaces that we were hoping to put in place on the back of development. We took quite a broad perspective on green infrastructure. I think these days it's second nature, but at the point that we were developing this, it felt like we were, I guess, thinking quite broadly. So our policies are not just about nature and biodiversity, but they're also about how people use them. So access and recreation in its widest sense being really key. So the evidence on nature connectedness that's piling up now suggests that people engage with the outside world through a real variety of lenses, only one of which is nature. So we need to reflect a sort of like a range of things that people value in the outside world. This set of policies, first block is, I guess, a water management perspective. So we tried to look for synergies really in our objectives. So trying to make sure that we sought SUDs that delivered for wildlife. Again, none of this is rocket science, but we really wanted to put it sort of be explicit about it in Benson's Neighbourhood plan. And then the final chunk was this collection of landscape-related components. So the whole idea of maintaining rural character, avoiding coalescence with other villages, and trying to manage that risk of a hard edge with all of these new houses around the edge of the village through thinking about a vegetated buffer that softens the overall impact. So we've learned a lot through the neighbourhood planning process, a lot of feeling our way, trying to work out which way was up, trial and error, and sometimes with the answer dawning on us just a bit too late in the day. So I'm not going to take you through a step-by-step chronology of how we went about it and the things that turned out to be important. Instead, I thought I'd just share a handful of reflections across the whole process and some of the things to watch out for that I kind of wish that I'd learned right at the outset. And this is very much a set of personal reflections. By no means did we get all of these steps right. So in flagging them up, they're almost note to self, really, as opposed to a sort of a recipe for perfection. So first of all, the starting point, look at what you've got in the area of interest, the sort of the village or settlement you're working in, and plan to celebrate it and create some love around it. Bit of an obvious one, I suppose, getting a map out, thinking big and think connectivity. It's that point really around wildlife and people as well, not really respecting parish boundaries. So you kind of need to have quite a broad perspective. But I suspect that's not news to the sort of folk who are signed up to this session. Tapping into data, really important. I mean, starting point always the local record centre data, just hugely valuable. But I think it's worth watching for gaps and applying a bit of, I suppose, sensible, does it add up challenge to what you end up with that way. We certainly found that there was some data that we wanted to take into account that didn't appear on the TVERC record, and it sort of drew a spotlight for us on some of the issues with that. I think as well, one of the things to watch out for is that developers will focus very much on the licensing species, the species that are associated with the licensing requirement. And I think that one of my, I suppose, my personal worries is that the whole planning process, I'm not sure it does a terribly good job of recognising wider biodiversity interest. Some of those really valuable places on a community's doorstep, I think really important to take account of. Worth in your plan having a biodiversity hook. It could be anything really. It almost doesn't really matter what it is as long as there's something. I know of one village locally that has focused on Roman snails. We chose pollinators, and this was partly about playing to your strengths really. We had a number of people in the village who were moth trapping, and another member of our team, a retired oceanographer who has spent the past 25 years recording the same transects through the parish for butterfly conservation. So we felt we had a really good story to tell around what we were looking to celebrate and what we were looking to sort of build on in our settlement. Just want to recognise the value of advice and conversation. I think it's just worth talking to lots of people and lots of organisations. And I found myself being a bit shameless, really, in terms of just picking up the phone, not repeatedly, but in the early stages, just having those key conversations about the way that our thinking was developing and testing it out. With folk who, I think, in terms of the practical application of this, were just much better informed than me and better able to identify flaws in our plan or to make suggestions about how we should develop our thinking. Being a bit careful about infill, that's a key one. I think there's a bit of a tendency particularly in villages, to look to value infill and to avoid expanding the boundary of the settlement. And I think it's one that we need to be really careful about, because often those little bits, those little pockets of space in a settlement, they're often the space for nature. And I think recognising what my heritage and landscape expert on my team had to say about it is there's a real risk of losing your sense of space and sky in a village by filling in all the gaps. The other more practical element of it as well is just being aware that lots and lots of pockets of infill don't really get you the investment that you need for the infrastructure you might need for a growing community. So it's definitely one to be careful about. Thinking about long-term green space management, there's still quite a perception out there that somehow green space looks after itself and that it happens for free. And I think we all know that that's not the case. So thinking in your policies about how you're planning for the cost of the long-term green space management, especially if you're wanting to manage it for wildlife, making sure that you fund for that and find funding for it. I've already touched on this one about neighbourhood planning not being enough on its own. You probably need a wider strategy. Being prepared to compromise. We certainly, and even now, we're still not getting exactly what we needed and what we need. So I think being pragmatic is a way of sort of saving your soul, I guess. Importance of communication. I think it's worth just really focusing on that and making sure there's a sort of a shared understanding of particularly with parish councils and kind of and other folk locally, making sure that you're clear about what you're setting out to achieve and the importance of what you're doing. I think is really important. And finally, this concept of recognising the array of audiences that a neighbourhood plan needs to speak to. So first of all, of course, you're looking to persuade and bring your community with you about the plan that you're putting in place, and you need them to support that through a referendum. But there are other folk who are going to be looking at the language and looking to be satisfied that this plan is robust and defensible. So the planners and developers are going to be interested, the statutory bodies are going to be interested in what you're setting out to do, and ultimately the inspectors. And lawyers in there because there are plenty of neighbourhood plans that have ended up in court defending appeals on specific sites. So I think you need to have your eyes open to an array of audiences when you're thinking about how you describe what you're setting out to do. So I thought I'd have a think too about what's been hard. And when I was preparing for this, I stumbled across a slide that captured at least part of this for me, and the journey that we've been on. It certainly made me smile, and probably Riley. And I think the lessons I've already shared on the last slide probably give you a bit of insight into what we've learned. But the next slide just captures a few more of these. So starting from the top, you can't choose your starting point for neighbourhood planning. I think when we started, Benson had already lost an appeal for a major development on the edge of the village. And certainly we found that with a developer for that biggest site, our leverage hasn't been as great as it might have been if the plan and the policies had taken full effect. But it's certainly given us a seat at the table and has legitimised the discussions, really constructive discussions we have with that developer now. But yes, you need to sort of need to plan on a variety of different starting points. Getting even, I think, your own sort of wider team to recognise the value of green infrastructure thinking at the outset isn't necessarily a sort of a foregone conclusion. I think there's still a bit of a risk that the green space thinking is regarded as the cherry on the top, the sort of thing that you think about at the end. And that presents a bit of a risk, really, in terms of your ability to plan and integrate environment into all the decisions that are going to be made through the process. Knowing the planning process, I think sometimes you need eyes in the back of your head if you're not a planning specialist. It can be a bit of a minefield, and certainly I know that we missed opportunities to influence at certain sort of practical stages in the process. Finding the time, neighbourhood planning is often done by volunteers, always done by volunteers. So I think fighting the battle with the time to input is just a sort of a constant challenge. And we found developers often a bit sniffy about the value of biodiversity enhancement, so your hedgehog-friendly fences and swift boxes and so forth. And we do have a policy around that. And I think for me, it's always good to question the benefits of an investment like this. But I think for me, I think there's a bit of a risk that dismissing those in terms of the value they actually deliver misses the sort of the opportunity that they present to enable householders, new residents, to feel as if they're participating in the wider effort. But yeah, I think that's going to be one that will run on and on. And the final point that I wanted to draw out here is, from a delivery perspective, the bit that really worries me is whether the implementation process around development actually works in terms of and the availability of advice to support it, whether all of that is set up for success for neighbourhood plan teams looking to engage in the practical implementation. So I'm going to unpack that set of issues just a little bit more through the lens of one specific example. And this image is the main new green space beside the most advanced development in Benson. So this is it's one that sort of tripped us up a little bit, and it's actually, I think, a microcosm of all the lessons and challenges that I've already shared. First of all, the planting plans. We found that because we didn't spot a bit of detail in one of the plans that we were looking at, part of the site's going to be planted with a fairly low interest country park grassland, which was just a little bit of a disappointment. Though I think we've now identified, with the help of some external stakeholders, a way forward that is positive. Secondly, we missed a key moment in the process to secure the long-term funding commitment that we'd identified as a need in our policy. So for this particular green space, the Section 106 doesn't actually provide for a commuted sum, opting instead to allow the developer to establish a management company and place the financial obligation for the management on the new residents. And that's just not really in line with the strategy we're developing. So we're now working with the developer and the parish and district authorities to look at bringing this space into public ownership. We also found that the landscape and ecological management plan isn't really sufficiently focused on managing for nature conservation interests. So we're working on developing a new one. And finally, the main question we're sort of wrestling with this at the moment, the big conundrum, is understanding the best approach to creating the site in a way that sets it up for success. So understanding how to influence how the creation is done, the kind of the whole process of scrutinising and making sure it's done well. I'd be really pleased to have advice from others who've been involved in this kind of activity. So please feel free to contact me outside this session, or even after I've finished speaking. So final slide on the neighbourhood plan element of this. The overall thrust of this final slide is that the world stands still for no man. We've got lots of delivery to contend with. We're looking at making some minor updates to our plan now that it's coming up on just over 2 years in existence. We're looking at our long-term strategy in terms of the future, and I suppose there's something there for us around responding to the changing public mood and the sort of opportunity that represents around environmental stuff. So the climate emergency and the biodiversity crisis are creating some interesting discussions with, for example, how EV charging points are the sort of the appetite for that kind of policy. And for me, donning, I suppose, a Natural England hat again, just thinking about nature recovery strategies, and what I see is just a really important role for communities in the future, in having an opinion really on how their local environment is managed and the contribution that they can make. So that's it from the neighbourhood planning perspective. But I was sort of just conscious that some of that stuff at the end might feel a little bit gloomy. So in the interest of finishing on something a bit more uplifting, I thought I'd just share a few reflections or a few insights into the sort of work that Benson is doing around the wider people and nature strategy work that we do. So there's a lot that I could share, but these next handful of slides, sort of half dozen or so, just give a bit of insight into the things that we've invested in and things that we've found are important. So our web presence and social media have been really important in creating profile for the activities we're undertaking. So both within the community and I suppose in showing the wider world that we're serious about what we're doing. And really importantly, the Facebook page in particular enables people in the community to participate in their own way. So whether it's asking for help with IDing something or just sharing a view that they love, that's been really important to us. Next, we found ourselves working with all sorts of people and sort of trying to sort of support and spark interest in others really. I mean, you can see the array of folk we're working with. I think it's probably not complete, but it does spread you a bit thin. But I think that what works in practice in a place is going to very much depend on local conditions. So I think recognising the scope for working with lots of different organisations is probably really important, and worth reflecting as well that patience is definitely the order of the day. It takes a while to build up the sort of the shared sense of an endeavour. Things that enable practical action are really popular. So we run lots of events, though our ambitions have been and activities have been a bit curtailed recently. But one of the most powerful things for us has been providing an outlet for people to do something practical about climate change. And this time last year on Remembrance Sunday in 2019, we had 80 people turn up to do a tree plant on one of our green spaces, which was just great fun and really heartening. Another event we run regularly, we have an annual moth breakfast, and the point about this one is making friends with your local experts. So Mark Botham in the picture from CEH has helped us run this event for quite a few years. But the thing that I wanted to draw out here really is what's been really fab is over the last 4 years or so, seeing the crowd that attends that sort of really build. So going from a handful of interested experts and one family to sometimes crowds of over 40 people over the past several years. The other thing is that thinking about things that enable children to do hands-on things is a really good way of engaging whole families across the community. And certainly my personal view in this is that they don't really need to be learning an awful lot, just making those memories in the natural world. And if you can offer something that's a bit different, like a night safari, or perhaps in the summer something that offers the opportunity to get wet, you're away in a hack, really. Um, this is just a sketch map of our green spaces, both the sort of existing ones and the new ones that are coming our way. And the point of this really is just that sharing insights with your community on what you've got, and sort of celebrating it and helping people to love it. And that just seems to go down really well in Benson. Really heartening. And I suppose the science these days tells us that the more connected people feel with their local environment, the more likely they are to actually take action. And I think that just raising awareness and sharing stuff with people just really helps to sort of like to mobilise that sort of public opinion in support. And the final slide really just um, sets out that I suppose that a lot of this stuff really, to make it happen, you need a sort of like a group of people working behind the scenes. But the interesting bit is that it really doesn't require everyone to be an expert. Um, Certainly, the thing that often strikes me is the difference that we can all make just by getting involved in the way that we can. So, whether it's organisation skills, networking, blagging free stuff, or just an eye for the possibilities in something, talent at filling in funding bids, it all really counts to making an endeavour like this actually work. And certainly, my personal perspective is I'd recommend it to anyone, because it's been one of the most rewarding things I think I've ever done. And I'm just going to finish by highlighting a couple of materials. They're on Benson Nature Group's website. One is a celebration of our activities from last year that we put out at Christmas. And then Wild About Benson is a film that we put together. It was actually meant to be the sort of the replacement for the field trip that was meant to be associated with this webinar. Well, what's turned out to be a webinar. So I hope that you enjoy that. And thank you very much for listening.